World-renowned wisdom from Miyamoto Musashi. In-depth like never before and ready for you to claim. The Musashi Field Manual. Available now at stickmanpublications.com.
Welcome to the Martial Arts and Life podcast with Kris Wilder.
Good day, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever it might be. Welcome to the magical world of podcasts and the Martial Arts and Life podcast. I'm Kris Wilder. I'm your host. Today is an interesting topic. It is about having a fiery heart. I was watching a rugby match the other day, and there was a gross penalty executed on the field, and somebody got a yellow card and got sent to the sidelines for a nice chunk of change. And the announcer said that, that player, he's a fantastic competitor, always, in the middle of everything, but you have to have a fiery heart and a cool head. And we oftentimes say things in the martial arts that are very similar to that. I was watching the NHL. I was watching a couple of teams square off. It was a good game. And I don't know, maybe it was the second period. Some kind of dust-off started to kick up. Now, I know you're shocked that there were fisticuffs at a National Hockey League game, but yeah, there was. And I watched this defenseman who was a good distance away from the action just sort of loop around on his skates casually, not pushing off or anything, just swung around, and his gloves just fell from his hands. Didn't flick them down or didn't lean into the fight, just dropped his gloves and casually skated 2 or 3 pushes right into the fray. This is a man who knew what he was about to do, clearly had done it before, and was of cool mind when he went into the fray. You've probably gathered over the course of the podcast that I do enjoy my contact sports. Rugby is fantastic. And hockey, well, if you want to follow the NHL, go ahead, join me. Follow the Calgary Flames. But in both of these sports, there is high contact. There are many opportunities to fight and to lose your cool. And I'm going to talk about that, losing your cool, in the context of martial arts. Before I set myself up as some sort of great marker in regard to losing your cool or not becoming angry, no, that is not me. I have certainly lost my temper, my facilities in much younger years. Absolutely. I'm not coming to you down from the mount with tablets in respect to this, but there is also some experience behind it as well. So with that disclaimer up front that I'm not a perfect executor of what I'm about ready to recommend to you, that we can proceed. If you think back to the last time that you lost your cool or became angry, and let's put it in an experience that we've probably all had or something very close to, and that is, let's call it a traffic incident where maybe somebody cut you off or they went in the wrong order at a 4-way stop, or, they just ignored the rules of the road, placing themselves at risk and others in danger. So however you want to shape that is fine, but it's a nice, easy, common experience that we can work from. And when you've had a chance to recall that moment, hopefully it wasn't just a minute ago, but you recall that moment where you were angry about that offense, I want you to think back to it, because what happens in the moments that we become angry is the act of anger is a non-integrated act. And here's what I mean by that. I mean that losing your cool is allowing the emotion to step outside of us and to seize us. We become the emotion. We become the anger. We don't control it anymore. In the firearms community, there is a phrase. It's simple and it's clear, and it is this: if you fire a round, it's yours. In other words, wherever that bullet goes, it's on you. It's your responsibility. And even if you're acting in a mayhem sort of manner and just firing, willy-nilly, those rounds are all your responsibility. You're going to get to own them. And there's going to be an accounting for each one of those rounds. That's the same way that it works with the disassociated anger, the anger that takes control. It's the difference between firing a round at a range and having it hit its mark and then having the target come back and starting doing an assessment. Oh yeah, that was a good placement, nice clustering. I'm going off a little bit here. You do your analysis and you get to own those rounds. But if you just fired them willy-nilly out in the middle of a field and you hit a side of a car parked in a driveway, a tree, maybe broke out a window of someone's house, you're responsible for those rounds no matter what generated it. You get to own them. You get to own the rounds on the firing range, and you get to own the rounds out in the middle of that field. When anger becomes disassociated or non-integrated, it's more like that second version. It's more like firing off rounds out in the field. They're not effective. They don't work at anything productive. They are dangerous, and I'm responsible for them. The controlled firing, of course, is in a controlled atmosphere, controlled behaviors, and there's a goal in mind. So this is a great example of that non-integrated emotion and what the results of it can be. Now, I know the context in the analogy is a little bit off, but you get the message. So if you have your emotion non-integrated within you, it means that it can rise up, it can take control, and you are now the puppet. In martial arts, we espouse control. It's everywhere in the way that we dress. You should be dressed nice and neat. Your belt should be appropriate, or your sash, or whatever it is. Patches, if you have them, should be worn in the right places. There are pieces of etiquette, whether it's bowing on and off the mat or bowing to your instructors, the courtesies and respects that are associated, but they're in there and they are followed. They are part of the discipline that we espouse. Then we go on to doing our forms, making sure that the form is correct so that the information that we're learning is conveyed to us as it should be, so that we get good technique to ultimately defend ourselves. And oftentimes there is some sort of meditation or preparation of the mind prior to training. Sometimes that happens just with the mere fact that you've gone into the locker room and put on your uniform, and everything begins to shift. And we've all seen those instructors that are older, in their 70s and 80s, who just seem like simple, not so strong individuals. in the world, and then when they strap that uniform on, yeah, it's Katie bar the doors. I mean, they got it figured out. They know what they're doing. They're standing a little straighter. They're moving a little swifter. They've gone through mind change, and they gained it through years and years of discipline. So, yeah, we espouse discipline and integration at a high level all the time. And if we're really to stay consistent and true with all of the actions that we take in respect to the development of our mind and our body and our spirit and the discipline that we use, then we have to make sure that our emotions are not disassociated from us, that they are integrated. That's a big process. But I am going to give you a simple trick of recognition that you can use very well to change some of that, because we all have those moments. I alluded to it earlier. In fact, I didn't just allude to it, I spoke directly to it. That, I haven't always been a master of my emotions. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that we should be without emotion, that we shouldn't enjoy life or have excitement or any of those kinds of things. But even the most joyful excitement can be damaging if there is an over-exuberance or an over-rotation, I guess is a good way to put it, on the emotion. And therefore, it begins to take control of us instead of us being the masters of our emotions. Here's a little thing that will help you audit some of your emotions. And we're talking specifically about anger, so let's just stay with anger. But this is applicable to almost all emotions. In fact, I can't really think of one that it's not, but I'm sure there is an outlier out there somewhere. It's called mind the gap. When there's an event, there's a gap, and then there's an act. There's an event, then there's a gap, and then there's an action. We understand the event, as we talked about a traffic incident, and that's a very easy thing to understand. But here's the thing that is the gap. There is a moment between what has happened and your response that is the gap. And it is that moment where you can choose to let that emotion go and run wild like an unbridled horse, with you just hanging on to its tail being dragged through the field. Or you can choose to put a saddle on that horse and ride it the correct way. The gap happens. It happens to everybody. Now, in a combative situation, we would call it the freeze. And for those of you who've trained to make the freeze small, which is, the act comes, there's a little bit of a freeze, and then there's an action. There's that gap in there, and that's what we call the freeze. But there's an emotional version of it as well, and that's the gap. If you grab the gap, you're going to be able to ride that horse, like I described. And when you begin to observe the gap, it becomes bigger. It becomes more obvious, and it becomes more manageable. Now, jumping into the gap and seizing it immediately is not an easy thing to do. So, as you start to employ this, do it in small ways. Take that moment when you have the luxury of time, see the gap, and what will happen is you will immediately launch out of the gap and into the emotion. That's when you bring it back. Because the emotion is like a bell curve, and you're just in the beginning of it. It's not ready to go off yet. Grab it, seize it, saddle it, bring it back. It takes practice. I'm not going to suggest to you that this is the be-all and end-all of emotional control or even truly integrating an emotion, but it is a way to take control of it and to not let it be a stray round or a wild horse. It is to take control of your firearm and your round, and it is to put the saddle on the horse. So very simply again, look for the gap. It will launch right past you, and you'll go straight into the emotion. Grab it, bring it back to the gap. Observe it, make a choice. Don't let the emotion make the choice. And as you do this over time, what you're going to find is that the time is going to expand in the gap. Like I said, it's become more observable. And when it becomes more observable, it's going to slow down. And you're going to be able to, in a matter of seconds, check that. Make it a blink of an eye. Change your emotion. And no one around you is going to be aware of what transpired inside your head and your heart that moment. So it's good to have a fiery heart, and it's also good to have a cool head. Those two should come together and work well together. Not so much like the rugby player that lost his control, but more like the hockey player that knew exactly what he was doing, precisely what was going to happen, and the terms and conditions in which he engaged. That is bringing integration into your actions. And I look forward to hearing from you, for those of you who've had an opportunity to practice this drill. And as you do, I think it's going to make you chuckle. As you get out on the floor and you're doing your martial arts, whether it's karate, judo, jiu-jitsu, and you're able to make that millisecond gap and make that choice and make that decision and not lose your cool, but keep it and be integrated and successful.
The Big Bloody Book of Violence, the smart person's guide for surviving dangerous times. What everyone must know about self-defense. Self-defense is not fighting. It's a lifestyle choice, a more enlightened way of looking at and moving through the world. The Big Bloody Book of Violence at Amazon.
Now I'd like to share with you a story of complete giving over to the emotion of anger. This happened in Seattle, and it happened up on Capitol Hill. And the best way to describe it is Seattle is a lot of hills and a lot of waterways, and at the top of these hills there's these communities. Capitol Hill is one of them. Well, we've had a large amount of snow by our reckoning. If you live in Wisconsin or Michigan, you're laughing at us right now. But it's enough that it has caused stifling of traffic and business, all of that kind of stuff. But there's still people out there. And there's two groups of people that are out there. There's the people that are enjoying the snow. I actually saw a cross-country skier coming down the road the other day. Or families out sledding or building snowmen. You know, all of the things that you would do in the snow. And then there's the people that are trying to get somewhere. Well, if you're a kid, as I was, and I'm sure you were too, and you're having a snowball fight, and a moving vehicle drives by, yeah, it's probably not the best choice, but you're inclined to pitch one at the car. See if you can hit it, you know. Again, not the best choice, but we understand that mind and the time, and there you go. So that's what happens on Capitol Hill. Boom. Snowball goes right off the windshield of a Jeep Grand Cherokee. Well, the woman driving it flips a Yui right there in the middle of the road. There's no traffic because it's all deep snow and some slush, and it's just a mess. And most people aren't out. But she flips a Yui, and there's a snowball fight going on across the street. And a bunch of people have to dive out of the way, run, to avoid being hit by her as she loops this Grand Cherokee around. I think it's fairly obvious at this point that the anger is in control, and tries to run down who she thinks are the culprits in this snowball that hit her rig, and is unsuccessful. Then gets out of her Jeep Grand Cherokee, takes her keys out of the ignition, and puts them into her fist. You know, like we're taught in the rape classes, wear your keys like this and starts coming at him. This is full-blown out of control. Now, we probably are having a little bit of a chuckle over this and shaking our heads and saying, what are you thinking? Well, the answer is clearly not. You know that moment, that gap, when you hit the brake in that Jeep and you're getting ready to turn around? You don't. There are a lot of ways to measure this, but for our purposes, we're concerned about that gap. There's the event, the gap, and the action. But the thing that makes this so interesting is that the action is doubled down on. Not only are other people put in harm's way, just like we talked about earlier, firing off a gun in a field randomly, but when unsuccessful in running down who she believed were the culprits. Now, put that in perspective. You're going to run over somebody with a multi-thousand-pound vehicle. You're willing to kill somebody over a snowball. And when that becomes unsuccessful, premeditatively put your keys in your fist and start to go after them in the most personal of ways. Absolutely out of control. It's a real-world example of how anger can become unleashed, detached, and non-integrated. Different than the rugby player, different than the hockey player, far more dangerous, and very, very real. I hope you've had a good time with martial arts and life this week. I appreciate you listening. I appreciate hearing from those of you who have enjoyed the podcast, and that makes it all worthwhile. So until next time, I'm Kris Wilder. Be well.